and welcome to a brand new episode of Talking Law from Women in the Law UK. I'm Sally Penni, a barrister based in Manchester at Kenworthy's Chambers and the Joint Vice Chair of the Association of Women Barristers. I'm also the founder of Women in the Law UK, an organisation which is passionate about supporting the next leaders in law. We put on regular events, host masterclasses, and also enjoy an annual dinner and conference. Do come and learn more about what we do at womeninthelawuk.com. You could also connect with us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Find us on Twitter at Women in the Law UK. On this episode, I'm absolutely thrilled to be talking law with the legendary barrister Courtenay Griffiths QC. Currently based in London at 25 Bedford Row, recently voted Crime Set of the Year, Courtenay practices predominantly in criminal defence, in hugely complex murder cases, as well as fraud and drug offences. Courtenay also chairs the Public Affairs Committee of the Bar Council. Courtenay began by telling me about his family, his background, and the events that led him to become a barrister. I just wanted to let you know, Courtenay talks about the racist abuse he suffered as a teenager and shares some of the deeply offensive names he was called. Some of you may find this language offensive.
I come from a family of 8 boys and 1 girl, and I'm due to become 65 this year. And I was born in Kingston, Jamaica. Shortly after I was born, my father had travelled to the UK to work. He's a carpenter. And because Coventry was flattened by the German Luftwaffe during the Second World War, he got a job there and helped to build all the new houses on the housing estates run by the local council. And also, he helped to build the new cathedral in Coventry. And he sent for us from Jamaica in 1961 when I was 5 years old. And we sailed on a liner from Kingston Harbour across the Atlantic to Genoa in northern Italy, where we were put on a train. No one was allowed off the train as it travelled through northern Italy, across France to Calais, and then a ferry from Calais to the UK. And I saw my father for the first time at Charing Cross train station in London. Then we drove all the way up to Coventry, where I grew up after that. And I was fortunate. I passed my 11 plus, and in 1968 started at Bablake School in Coventry. From 1968 until 1974 when I left, I was the only black face in that school. When I left and went to LSE, and I'll be quite frank with you, the biggest mistake I think I made in my whole life was studying law at university. None of the law that I studied at university has ever featured in my legal career. How much of the law you studied have you used in court? Do you use the law on trust, on property? Have you ever used them? All the other subjects you had to study? No, you don't. Because the bottom line is, you picked up the law that you practice after you started practicing. What I would have preferred to have done was study history at university and then done the 1-year course before taking the bar exam. Knowing what I know now, that's how I would have done if I had any knowledge that that was possible. But my problem was none of my older siblings had any kind of university background at that stage. And the reason why I chose to become a barrister is because my father spoke all the time about Norman Manley, who became a QC here in the UK just before the Second World War and actually practiced here during the war, then returned to Jamaica, where he was one of the most prominent barristers in the country and almost became the first Prime Minister of Jamaica. And my dad spoke about him all the time. But there was another reason why I chose to study law, and that is because of the racism I faced from the police, and indeed, most black young people back then in the 60s and 70s, and the way police treated me, because in the center of Coventry, in the precinct where all the shops were, there was a small police box about the size of a cell. And on more than one occasion, I was grabbed, pushed in there, shouted at, called nigger, and everything else like that, and then pushed out and could go, not charged. And for that reason, and the way, for example, my father was treated, so that if any incident happened in Coventry involving a black youngster, our front door in Galston Road would get kicked down. My father would be pushed out of the way, and they'd pull all the older youngsters, those like 16, 17, and 18, out of their beds down to the police station. So it's that experience which caused me to think it might be an idea for a black man to become a barrister, but also become a criminal defense barrister. And that's what I've done now for 40 years.
Yes. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you chose that path. Can I ask you about some of the high profile cases you've been involved in, both here in Britain at the Old Bailey, where you spent over 30 years of your time, and internationally? How did you firstly become a QC? And then I want to talk about some of those cases, such as Damilola Taylor, Charles Taylor at the ICC.
I've been a QC since 1998. Sally, you've got to understand that at one level, I was very fortunate. I went to a set of chambers, which is now called Garden Court, which at the time was led by Ian MacDonald. He'd been involved in the trial of all those people from Notting Hill, which is one of the first major trial of black men at the Old Bailey. And so he and I, despite him being from Scotland and me from Jamaica, we had a lot in common politically and about issues of racism. And so he was very helpful. But things really started to change in terms of my options when I was appeared in the first Blakelock murder trial. And I was led in that trial by Mike Mansfield, and we were representing a juvenile boy, one of three juveniles in that trial, along with three adults. All three adults were convicted. All three juveniles were acquitted. That was the first trial. And Mansfield wasn't even a QC at the time. So, despite of his abilities and how good he was in the court, he wasn't. As a result of that connection, he and I thereafter did a few IRA cases. So we did one regarding the bombing at Harrods. We also did another one regarding the bombing in Brighton, where Margaret Thatcher almost died. I learned a lot from that relationship. But the real step for me came about 10 years later, in about 1990. One of the few black solicitors around instructed a young man called Michael Hall. We were in the same chambers. And he suggested to that solicitor that I lead him. The interesting thing was, if I recall properly, there were 5 defendants. All of them were black, all of them were from Jamaican backgrounds. They all came from Brixton in South London for the shooting and killing of a so called yardie, someone who had not long arrived from Jamaica. Now, the interesting thing was, nobody in the courtroom, apart from me and Michael Hall, spoke and understood patois. So for me, being able to cross-examine a Jamaican yardie in a patois and ask him properly so I understand, provided me with a skill which there were few other people in the courtroom could understand. I was only 10 years old. Everybody else was represented, if I remember properly, by QCs. And we were in front of the Recorder of London. And when I was standing up, right from the start, he looked rather upset that this young black man was involved in such a serious case as this. But as the trial progressed, his attitude towards me changed. And the bottom line is, thereafter, well, he was starting to smile. He was starting to listen to me for a change. And thereafter, I was able to do quite a few of those cases, leading, opposed by QCs all the time, for quite a while. And that's what lifted my reputation more than anything else. Given what the bar was like when I started, times had changed. When I came into the profession in 1980, there were only about 20 to 30 black people practicing, one black female. And the leading barrister at the time, who wasn't white, was Rudy Narayan. And so much has changed about this profession since then. When I started, the vast majority of barristers wore bowler hats, a black jacket, striped trousers. And back then, when you became a pupil, you had to pay your pupil master. Garden Court Chambers, which I joined, was the first chambers to pay pupils. That's standard rate now, but it wasn't like that at the outset. So times have changed in many ways. And I'll be quite frank, when I started, the racism spoken by judges, even at courts like the Old Bailey, was outstandingly bad. Times have changed that way. I have to say that. And not only has it changed with the judges, most of the police officers I deal with now today, I have come to like and respect. I'm not saying that overall police officers have rejected racism and certain racist activities totally. But in terms of the officers that I'm dealing with on a personal basis in the courtroom, I don't have that problem with them anymore, not at all. And what I think and ought to advocate is some kind of greater cooperation with what the police are doing. But I'm going to come back to that because there's a particular reason in my mind why we ought to be concentrating with the police in addressing certain kind of activities which occur primarily in the communities we are members of. Because over the last 30 years, having been made QC, but starting before that, I've been working at the Old Bailey. And what concerns me about it is the fact that there are 18 courts at the Old Bailey. On any given day, and this hasn't just started over the last 10 years, on any given day, if you tour every court in the Bailey, I promise you, the vast majority of trials involve Black young men between the ages of 14 and 25. And in most of the cases they're involved in, they're anything between two up to even 10 and 12 defendants on trial for the one crime. Some shooting, mostly knifing. And the central issue is joint enterprise. That is the main legal issue which is confronted. And I'm just fed up of that now. And the question is, how do we go about addressing it? One of the points we have to bear in mind is that most of these young black men who arrive in court were kicked out of school. And so as a result, they had to find an alternative way of making a living. And a lot of them did. And we know what the primary thing to do was. But one consequence is a large number of them have real difficulty performing in the witness box and convincing the jury that they're not guilty. And there is another reason why that is of importance. You see, when I started doing those kind of murder trials at the Bailey, the main point came from eyewitnesses and also from police officers who fitted them up by lying about what they'd said to the police in interview at the police station following arrest. That changed after 1985 and the introduction of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. And so now, in these trials, the central evidence is CCTV, mobile phones, and tracking the movement of motor vehicles to the scene where the murder took place. And so, as a result, there have been occasions where there have been no eyewitness evidence at all. All the jury are left with is a CD showing all the relevant CCTV. And that's why the performance of the defendant from the witness box is critical. And much of that has made me want to change my mind about doing those kind of cases back to back. And, following a conviction, for example, you come out of the main door at the Old Bailey and mother's there crying. Father was never in the court. The father turns up very few times. And that's why what I'm suggesting is to address that issue in the community. I think we as Black people need to be working with the police, need to be working with school teachers, need to be working with local councillors, need to be working with politicians so that the whole issue surrounding knife related murder trials can be addressed as a national issue. It really concerns me. And I'm really upset that it's not getting the prominent kind of attention it should be at this particular time.
Yes. Well, you've outlined what needs to be done, and it'll be good to get people on board. Can I ask you about you've mentioned already some of the high profile cases you've been involved in, and there are many. Can I ask you about then the Charles Taylor case, which I've been saying took place at The Hague, at the International Criminal Court, but it didn't, did it?
No, it
Quite.
didn't. No, what happened was Taylor was charged with committing war crimes, not in Liberia, where he was the president, but next door in Sierra Leone. The charges against him were brought by an American lawyer who had been in the Pentagon. At that time, Taylor was in Ghana attending a peace conference. He hadn't yet retired as president of Liberia. And basically, he was charged with, in effect, putting together the RUF, which was a revolutionary force established in Sierra Leone. He wasn't charged for the crimes committed during the Liberian Civil War, which at one level was lengthier than what occurred in Sierra Leone and two, more violent. Now, you appreciate that Tony Blair was prime minister. And so a court, the special court for Sierra Leone, was set up in Freetown in Sierra Leone. Blair and a certain British QC, his head of chambers at Doughty Street at the time, opened up that court in Freetown in Sierra Leone. But when it came to the trial of Charles Taylor, the Sierra Leonean government were concerned that if they tried him in that court next door in Freetown to Liberia, they might have war problems with Taylor supporters in Liberia. So they asked for a court abroad where Taylor could be tried. And the Dutch government said, yes, you can use the ICC building in The Hague. So we went to The Hague to do the Charles Taylor case. But the Dutch says, yes, you can use that building in The Hague. If he's convicted, he's not going to serve his sentence in Holland. Guess where Taylor is serving his 50 years? In a prison in Northumberland in northern England. And no doubt he'll be serving that sentence here in England, who formerly owned the colony of Sierra Leone for 50 years.
Wow. Now, let's just get a head around that, because that means he's not privy to our sentencing regime, but
Precisely.
that of that court, essentially. So he won't be released having served half.
No.
No. So he'll die in prison, effectively.
Sally, just to be honest with you, right? Understand this. In many ways, as I mentioned earlier, Taylor could have been tried for certain things that occurred during the war in his country, Liberia. And the funny thing is, the woman who became the president after Taylor was deported to Nigeria, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, she had opened the war in Liberia with Taylor. And you remember, when Taylor goes on trial, Sirleaf is president, and she's highly supported by Blair and the US government. As a result, even though the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Liberia accused both Taylor and Johnson Sirleaf of crimes committed during that civil war, there was never a trial. And can you appreciate why? If there was such a trial, Taylor would have to be in the dock with Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman president in Africa. Okay? And given her support for countries like the UK and the US, there was no stomaching of the idea of Taylor being tried for what happened in Liberia. That's why, despite the fact that the prosecution brought into the Taylor trial everything that he did in Liberia, He was only being tried for what had occurred in Sierra Leone, his own country, surprisingly. And that has shocked me because, at one level, having gone through all of that period, I believe factually and evidentially a trial of Taylor and Johnson Sirleaf and certain others for what happened in Liberia might have had and told a lot more truth than I heard during the Taylor trial.
Well, tell me, during that trial, the supermodel Naomi Campbell gave evidence. Now, it's frequently misunderstood that you called her. You didn't. Why was she there giving evidence? Who called her?
There was a lot of reasons for that. There wasn't a great deal of publicity about the trial.
No.
The opening speeches by both myself and the prosecution was fully attended and live on TV globally, but not many people watched it. And what happened is the trial was due to start in June 2007, but for a number of reasons, Taylor decided he didn't want to be represented by the young man then representing him. And whilst I was at Heathrow Airport on my way out to Jamaica to give a lecture, I got a call from the guy who was in charge of the defense teams out in Freetown in Sierra Leone. And he asked me if I wanted to do it. I'd never done such a trial before. And I thought, why not? Because remember I told you I was fed up with the Old Bailey. So the end of June 2007, I went out to The Hague and I took the case on the basis it was going to last about 8.5 months. You know how long I spent there? 5 years. I'll tell you what, I knew from the outset that Taylor was going to be convicted. Not because of the evidence, but for political reasons. Because the Americans and the UK didn't want him back in Africa. And I told Taylor that right at the outset. I said, you're going to be convicted, Mr. Taylor. And although, that might sound quite damaging at this early stage, it will happen because of the politics and not the evidence. Because the curious thing was, Taylor is supposed to be running what's going on, done by the RUF in Sierra Leone. There was no forensic evidence at all. There was no evidence that Taylor ever entered the country. There was no photograph of him there, fingerprints, or anything. Furthermore, he's supposed to be providing large amounts of arms over the boundary into Sierra Leone. Yet, no satellite evidence shows that. Nothing like that whatsoever. You know what? Perhaps I'd say 4/5 of the evidence relied upon was people who had lost arms, people who had died, women who'd been raped, people who'd been captured and used almost as slaves. All right? That's who the prosecution relied upon. And yet the point is, there was nothing to cross-examine them about because he wasn't there. And he was therefore in no position to say, that didn't happen to you. And that was 2/3 of the case. By the time the defense case started, Charles Taylor was in the box giving evidence in chief for about 8 months. And by the time we got to the defense case and finished his evidence, the people who were giving money to the special court for Sierra Leone were beginning to lose interest and concerned about giving further monies to that court. And guess what then happened? The prosecution, during the defense case, called Naomi Campbell. And for the first time during that trial, there was attention being given all around the world because of who it was. And I just found that shocking. And that's when I really fell out with the court. And I'll be quite frank with you, was quite rude to both the prosecution and the judges in the courtroom. So much so that at one stage I was charged and had to bring in a defense lawyer for myself. But that charge eventually was dropped. Thereafter, the worst thing that happened was this. There were four judges, one from a Pacific island, one from Northern Ireland, one from Uganda, and one from Senegal in West Africa. He was there just in case something happened to the other three. But by the time it came to the announcement of the verdict, three of the judges agreed to convict Taylor. This one from Senegal, as he was about to give a dissenting judgment, they closed the blind on the public gallery, told the clerk to switch off the microphone, and thereafter tried to eradicate what he said from the transcript. It shocked me. It really shocked me. But at one level, it didn't surprise me.
The Damilola Taylor case, you were involved in that. He was a little boy who was murdered by two youths, and you represented one of the accused. I just wondered, you've dealt with very difficult, complex, emotionally complex cases. The job for us at the bar doesn't really allow for emotion. And I wondered if you could just talk about that case because it did have an impact on you.
I appreciated right from the outset that because the deceased person was a young black child, why are you, a black man, representing those alleged to have done it? But the starting point for my concern was the fact that the evidence relied upon against the six juveniles tried in the original trial in 2002 was totally appalling. The main witness, Cole, was a young girl who, at one point during the trial, swore and walked out and had to be brought back in. At one stage, when she was being interviewed, claiming that she had witnessed some of what occurred, she was asked by the police officer interviewing her, where did this occur? And she points to somewhere on the map shown, which was completely wrong. And the officer grabbed her hand, pulled her hand across the map, and said, no, it was there. Why? And hear what happened after that. The judge, who had heard all of that evidence, it was the evidence upon which the prosecution sent him, rejected her evidence and said that evidence should be taken away from the jury. So, what was the next step? The prosecution then went out to the young offenders prison out near Heathrow Airport and traded with young defendants on remand there about what they'd heard and what they'd seen. And that is evidence again. Much of it was shown in cross-examination to be lies and rejected. And why all of this happened was this. You know that this trial was the first thing the Metropolitan Police, major thing, were facing after what happened to Stephen Lawrence. And so they were wanting to show to the public, look, we take the death of black people very seriously. And, it was a price to pay because there are other consequences for me. For example, the father of Damilola Taylor, who was living as a major civil servant in Nigeria at the time of the trial, came over. And, he was very angry towards me as I was walking out of the courtroom. And not just once, more than once. So, yes, I went through certain things. I arrived at court one day and was told by the courtroom usher a letter had arrived for me containing shit and that it had been dumped and thrown away. And so I appreciated right from the outset what the consequences might be. But happily for me, given the nature of the evidence and given the nature of the way in which the police and the prosecution proceeded, the jury acquitted all of those defendants, all of them. And so it's one of the worst experiences I've been through. It totally was shocking.
Yes, it was, but that poor boy was murdered very, very young, and justice was sought, wasn't it? I don't say that the methods that you say were used were right or wrong, but it remains, doesn't it? We are officers of the court. Our trade is dealing in evidence and looking at evidence in the cases that we deal with, but it does come with quite often many other things outside of the courtroom. So, can I ask you, what do you do for well-being? You know, at the bar, burnout is high. The rate of retention, certainly for women and at the publicly funded bar, is high. People are leaving left, right, and centre. How do you look after yourself mentally, emotionally, physically?
Well, for most of that time, I was very busy in terms of dealing with the work weight required because on many occasions it was back to back murder trials. The same crime, murder, and the same kind of pressure from parents of the client and the clients themselves. But I also read a lot because from when I was at school, I was, reading a lot of books about Marxism. And in fact, was reading stuff by, do you remember C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian man who wrote The Black Jacobins? I was reading a lot of that kind of stuff at the same time. And something else I have to be honest about, and it's this. From when I was maybe 6 years old, I was a major supporter of Liverpool Football Club. It's the only club I've ever cared about, even though at the outset it was very white. Because remember, John,
Yes, I
right, very right.
know. Until John Barnes.
Well, they had one before that, a mixed race guy from Liverpool 8. They didn't keep him for very long. But Steve Highway was a left winger, played football the way Jamaicans did, where the whole idea was to dribble past someone. That was more important than scoring a goal. And he played that way. And that's what brought my eyesight to him and caused me to follow Liverpool. I always have done. They would have won this year and should have won a few years ago as well. So I'm not very happy. I've also watched games between Tottenham and Arsenal because they're funny. The way they speak to each other, I love it. I also like West Ham. I've been to West Ham. I've been to Charlton, Crystal Palace. So you talk about what else I do. I do a lot of that. You know the other thing I do? I'm into records. I used to work with a sound system in Coventry called Jabadis. I also did a football team there called Jabadis, which was all Caribbean. So I've got a massive record collection from all the way back then. Loads of CDs. I've still got the record player here and the speakers. And happily for me, I love gardening. I'm into all of that. I'll do that.
I know you're also a family man. Have you encouraged your two sons to go into law at all?
Well, actually, Sally, I have three sons. All right.
Oh, sorry, forgive me.
The first son, he's now 40 odd. He's the eldest one, right? And he lives in Wandsworth, but works in the city, recruiting accountants. The second one, Marcus, you might have seen, he was Zav in Holby City. And he's also been with the Royal Shakespeare Company for many, many years. And the youngest one, Adam, he makes films and adverts. And so they're all doing very well. And I'm proud of them and glad to have them.
But can I ask, did you discourage the boys from going into law, or they just not fancy it?
They didn't fancy it. I hoped that they would, but they didn't fancy it at all. Because at the school they attended, whilst I was doing the Damilola Taylor trial, they were getting a bit of offence from some of the other schoolboys that your dad's defending him. And also because, they've got other talents. And given what's happening at the bar now, particularly with what's after legal aid, I'm glad they're not in it because life has changed for barristers now because of that change. And, because of what is happening now, because of this pandemic, my suspicion is that the use of phones and the Skype program to conduct certain hearings is going to become a permanent feature. Why? It costs less. And what's the consequence going to be? Legal aid is going to get even lower. That's the bottom line. And so I'm kind of glad my boys decided they didn't want to pursue this.
I suppose on that, then, I'm 20 years call. There are many I've interviewed on here who are 10 years call and less, the secret barrister being one, Joanna Hardy, others coming behind us. What advice would you have for people, for those entering the law now, and for those to try and gain momentum to remain in the law?
What I would suggest they do is decide which kind of practice they want to go into. Because nowadays it's very difficult to become a barrister. Because as you appreciate, Sally, each year there's something like 1,500 students who do the BPTC, which is the qualification, the further qualification after a law degree to become a barrister. But they can't be called to the bar unless they get pupillage. And the bar now only provides like 500 pupils, okay? Which means that 1,000 people who have spent like 18 grand for that 1 year BPTC course are not going to get pupillage. And they've got to do that pupillage within 5 years. Otherwise, they're going to take the exam all over again. So each year, there are thousands of people applying for like 500 pupillages. So, question number one is, do you really want to go to the bar and become a barrister? Question number two is, have you done enough to develop the kind of skills barristers require? That is primarily one, confidence, two, the ability to stand up and orally put across to the judge or to the jury the points that you want to make, and your understanding of the rules. That is so important. What does that mean? What it means is when you're doing your law degree, Do not just concentrate on the law. Spend time in courtrooms, from the magistrates all the way up to the top, just to see how barristers are performing, how good they are, and what you can learn from them. So that by the time you come to apply for the pupillage, much of which requires that you do put on a performance, that you know precisely what it is to do. And also, you need to be doing as much work in legal areas as is possible during that period, so that when you come to that application, you have a lot of abilities right across the board to depend on. Bear in mind also what is happening with legal aid is being reduced. So where are you going to get the money from when you start out? And also bear in mind, it's still the case that Oxbridge, LSE, and University College dominate and get into the bar a lot easier than people from other universities. So think about it and think about what kind of career you should be thinking about joining. I'm not even sure if I would, at this stage, consider becoming a barrister. But I tell you what I am considering to do now. I'm considering to do a lot more work in the Caribbean, where I've done a lot of cases in Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos, Anguilla, and I love it. And I'm at a stage now where I'd much prefer to do that than to be doing murder trials at the Old Bailey. It's so relaxing. But I've also done a case in South Africa, which and I love South Africa. You know, and the reason why I did that case was that the highest judge in the Supreme Court in Western Province, which is in Cape Town, was being, brought before a tribunal. And the evidence in the case involved two of the highest judges in South Africa. And so it would mean cross examining two people who were in the Supreme Court, the highest court in the country. So guess what? The local special counsel, the equivalent of QC, didn't want to do it. So I got a phone call, Mr. Griffiths, are you willing to come out to South Africa and represent this judge? I says, you're damn right I am. And I went down there, spent a couple of months. I loved it. I loved it. And I'd love to go back down there. And in fact, got another case after that, but it was all paperwork. So yeah, those are the things I'm enjoying now.
Well, can I ask you then? You've been at the bar for 40 years. Do you have a favorite fictional lawyer or a favorite book you can share with me, or a quote that's meaningful to you?
Not really, Sally, because you remember the first one was Rumpole, right?
Yes.
And yes, I watch Rumpole all the time because I knew the guy who wrote the book. He was still in the temple at the time, but I always found it very funny and enjoyed it, But I'm not so sure about some of the stuff that's coming out nowadays. And also, I actually acted in a trial,
Did
to the
you?
jury. Yes, yeah, I was
Which one?
jury trial. It's called. It was a series run by, I think it was BBC Two. And it was filmed in front of a retired judge from Liverpool who I knew well. But yeah, I did that film, and it's called Jury Trial.
Jury trial. Well, I'm going to look it up.
Yeah, look it up. All of the major trials that I did, like Charles Taylor and Hopley down in South Africa. If you go on YouTube, you can get the videos of what happened, of like my opening speech for Charles Taylor, which is funny.
Right.
I even quoted Bob Marley in it.
Well, tell me, Courtney, you have been a significant role model to many people at the bar from all sorts of backgrounds. You have been in practice for a considerable amount of time. You're a recorder and a QC as Silk. I wonder, therefore, what's next? There are vacancies in the High Court and the Supreme Court. Might you be thinking about going upwards?
It hasn't really crossed my mind. I was a recorder for 13 years and it was fun. But you know what the most difficult part was for me? Having spent most of my career doing murder trials, which I've one sentence, life imprisonment. So when I was sitting as a judge, you know what the most difficult thing was for me? Sentencing, non-life sentencing. It just terrified me. I just found it really difficult. And also, because of what I was doing, I was getting moaned at by, leaders of the Southeastern Circuit that I wasn't sitting long enough because I just couldn't because of the work I was doing. And so I decided, given that so many people are applying to become, recorders, quite a few of whom were black, I thought, well, recruit somebody else. Recruit somebody else. Because there are good people out there who will be a much better recorder than I would be.
But isn't there an argument that we still don't have that diversity represented in the senior parts of the legal profession?
Well, Sally, to be quite frank with you, there are a lot more black people coming into the bar. And when I say
Yes.
black, I mean African, Caribbean, and indeed Indian and Pakistani backgrounds. Okay? There are a lot more of them coming into the profession. So to that exchange has changed a great deal from when I came in. But it has much further to go. One of the problems at the bar, which still concerns me, is that most high court judges are recruited from chambers doing commercial, chancery, that kind of work. But those are the very areas in the bar where black people aren't being recruited. So that most of the black people coming into the bar are doing legal aid work, family, crime, immigration. And not as many are succeeding into the commercial side of this profession. And those are the difficulties which is going to hinder the diversification of the higher courts in this country.
Yes, yes, it will. Now, finally, if not the bench, have you thought about writing a memoir? I was asking you earlier about what next. I know you received the Legal 500 Outstanding Lawyer Award with Dame Helena Kennedy QC, which was quite an honor, and I'm so delighted for you. But I just ask you again, what next? Because I know outside of the law, you are chair of a charity, aren't you?
Yes, it's based in Lewisham. And what we're trying to do is to teach kids about how to progress. So that, for example, in all of these schools, what we'll do is in the main hall, we'll put together like a dozen circle of tables. Each is like 6 boys and girls from the school. On each table will be someone from a different background. So I might be sitting on one, a doctor on another, a dentist on another, and so on. And we talk to the kids briefly about how to be, how to do the same job as me, what the skills are that you require, when you've got to start working on it. And what we have is someone who has a bell, right? After about 10 minutes, the bell is rung. And you, as the mentor, has to go to another table. The kids get a chance to meet all these different professionals. And we've done it many, many times. I've done it several times. We're called Urban Synergy. I enjoy it.
Yes.
And I also spend a lot of time, giving lectures at university, which is why I've ended up with 4 honorary doctorates.
I know, the Doctor of Laws. I mean, wow.
They started complaining to me because I wasn't calling myself Dr. Courtenay Griffiths. So I've changed it now.
Well, it really is quite an achievement and it's been quite a profession. Have you thought about writing memoirs? Because really, you've had an extraordinary career and still are having it. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not, retiring you off, but an extraordinary career at the bar and life really from where you came from what the bar was like and the changes you've seen. So I just wondered, if it's something you've considered, particularly as you've not quite answered my what's next question.
Well, more than likely that will come up because I have a pretty massive book collection and I might get to a stage where I want to do that, particularly in light of what's happening financially at the bar. I'm not really fussy about being full time in court anymore. I'm not really interested in it. If something comes up which looks interesting or challenging, I'll do it. But I'm not going to pursue cases the way I have done in the past. Not doing it again. And so that might give me the time to turn to doing some writing. I'd enjoy doing that.
A huge thank you to the incredible Courtenay Griffiths QC for his time and fascinating stories. Thank you again for listening to Talking Law with me, Sally Penni. Do connect with me on Twitter @SallyPenni1. We'd love it if more people heard our podcast, so if you could spare just a couple of minutes to leave us a review, that will help people find us. Until the next episode, do check out the latest Women in the Law UK book. It's a look at how far the profession has come in the last 100 years, featuring career and well-being advice from women and men. It's available now on Amazon. Just search for Talking Law by Sally Penni. And don't forget to visit us at womeninthelawuk.com for all the latest news about our organisation. We look forward to connecting with you. Talking Law was produced by Sam Walker and is a What Goes On media production. Bye for now.